The morning sun peeked over the horizon, casting long shadows across the abandoned railroad. The rails, once gleaming with the passage of countless trains, were now dull and rusted, buried in a blanket of overgrown weeds. Birds sang from the nearby trees, but their melodies felt out of place, as if nature itself was unsure of this forgotten place. A convoy of trucks rumbled down the dirt road, breaking the eerie stillness. Each vehicle carried tools, supplies, and most importantly, a team of seasoned railroad workers. They had been hired by the state to restore this old line, a project that had been in the works for years, but always seemed to fall through. Today, however, the work would begin. As the trucks parked and the workers disembarked, the crew leader, Frank Simmons, a burly man in his 50s with a graying beard and piercing blue eyes, gathered his team around for a briefing. Frank had spent his life on the rails, fixing tracks and ensuring the smooth operation of countless trains. He was a man who had seen it all, or so he thought. "All right, listen up," Frank called out, his voice firm and authoritative. "We've got a lot of work ahead of us. This line's been out of commission for nearly 30 years, and it's our job to bring it back to life. Stick to your assignments, stay sharp, and let's get this done." The crew nodded, their faces a mix of determination and apprehension. They were skilled workers, but the tales they had heard about this particular stretch of railroad lingered in their minds. Stories of deadly accidents, unexplained disappearances, and ghostly apparitions had become local legend. One of the newer workers, a young man named Jake, couldn't shake the feeling of unease. He had heard the stories from his grandfather, who had worked on the railroad years ago. According to him, this line was cursed, a place where the souls of the dead still roamed, seeking justice or revenge. "Hey, Frank," Jake spoke up, trying to keep his voice steady. "You ever hear the stories about this place?" Frank sighed, his eyes narrowing slightly. "I've heard them, Jake. Ghost stories, superstitions. That's all they are. We're here to do a job, not chase shadows." The crew dispersed, each member heading to their assigned tasks. As they began clearing the overgrowth and assessing the damage to the tracks, a palpable tension hung in the air. The old railroad seemed to pulse with an unnatural energy, an invisible force that watched and waited. By midday, the sun was high, and the workers took a break for lunch. They gathered around a makeshift table, their conversations subdued. It wasn't long before one of the local townsfolk, an elderly man named Bill, approached them. Bill had lived in the area his entire life and knew more about the railroad's history than anyone else. "Afternoon, gentlemen," Bill greeted, his voice raspy with age. "I see you've started work on the old line. Brave souls, the lot of you." Frank offered a polite nod. "Afternoon, Bill. You got any advice for us?" Bill chuckled, a sound that held no humor. "Just this. Respect the dead. This railroad's seen more than its fair share of tragedy. The spirits here don't take kindly to being disturbed." The workers exchanged uneasy glances, but Frank dismissed the old man's warning with a wave of his hand. "Thanks for the advice, Bill. We'll keep that in mind." As the afternoon wore on, the crew returned to work, but the unsettling feeling grew stronger. Jake, assigned to clear a section of the track near an old, dilapidated signal house, couldn't shake the sensation of being watched. The hairs on the back of his neck stood on end, and he found himself glancing over his shoulder more than once. It was then that he heard it, a faint whisper carried on the wind. It was indistinct at first, just a murmur of sound, but as he strained to listen, the words became clearer. "Help us, please." Jake froze, his heart pounding in his chest. He looked around but saw no one. The rest of the crew was too far away to have spoken to him. The whisper came again, more urgent this time. "Help us. Find peace." He dropped his tools and backed away from the track, his breath coming in rapid gasps. He knew he should tell Frank, but something held him back. The fear of being ridiculed, of being dismissed as just another believer in ghost stories, kept his mouth shut. As the day drew to a close, the crew gathered their tools and prepared to leave. The sun was setting, casting a blood-red glow over the landscape. Shadows lengthened and the air grew cold. Frank gave the order to pack up, and the workers were all too eager to comply. They loaded the trucks in record time, anxious to leave the haunted railroad behind. As the convoy drove away, the old railroad fell silent once more. The shadows deepened, and the whispering voices faded into the night, leaving the promise of more terrifying encounters yet to come. The first night at the camp was anything but restful. The workers had set up their tents in a small clearing near the tracks, with a bonfire crackling at the center to ward off the chill. Despite the warmth of the fire, an unsettling coldness seemed to seep into their bones. Jake lay in his sleeping bag, staring at the canvas ceiling of his tent. The whispering voices he had heard earlier still echoed in his mind. He had managed to keep his fear hidden from the others. But now, in the darkness, it was impossible to ignore. Around him, the other workers had fallen into an uneasy sleep. The night was unusually quiet, with not even the chirping of crickets to break the silence. It was as if the entire forest was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. Jake's eyes grew heavy, and he was on the verge of drifting off when a sudden noise snapped him awake. It was a faint, almost imperceptible sound, like the rustling of leaves or the distant murmur of voices. He sat up, straining to hear. The sound grew louder, resolving into distinct whispers. They seemed to come from all around him, echoing through the trees and along the abandoned tracks. Jake's heart pounded as he unzipped his tent and peered outside. The fire had burned down to embers, casting a dim, flickering light. Shadows danced and shifted at the edge of the clearing, creating the illusion of movement. Jake scanned the darkness but saw nothing. "Who's there?" he called out, his voice trembling. The whispers ceased abruptly, replaced by an eerie silence. For a moment, Jake wondered if he had imagined the whole thing. Then, just as he was about to retreat into his tent, he saw it. A shadowy figure standing on the tracks, illuminated by the pale light of the moon. Jake's breath caught in his throat. The figure was tall and indistinct, its features obscured by darkness. It seemed to be watching him, though he couldn't see its eyes. "Hello," Jake whispered, his voice barely audible. The figure didn't respond. Instead, it began to move, gliding along the tracks with an unnatural smoothness. Jake watched in horror as it passed through the rusted rails and overgrown weeds, heading towards the old signal house. Unable to contain his fear any longer, Jake scrambled out of his tent and ran to wake Frank. He shook the crew leader's shoulder, his hands trembling. "Frank! Frank, wake up!" Frank groaned and sat up, rubbing his eyes. "Jake, what the hell is it? What's wrong?" "I saw something. Someone on the tracks," Jake stammered. "A shadow or a ghost, I don't know. It was heading towards the signal house." Frank sighed, his expression a mix of annoyance and concern. "Jake, you're letting those ghost stories get to you. It's probably just your imagination." "No, Frank, I swear it was real," Jake insisted. "Please, come and see for yourself." Reluctantly, Frank got to his feet and followed Jake to the edge of the clearing. They stood together, staring at the tracks. The figure was gone, leaving only the whispering wind and the rustling of leaves. "There's nothing here," Frank said after a moment. "Just the night playing tricks on you. Go back to bed, Jake." Jake opened his mouth to argue, but the look on Frank's face silenced him. He nodded reluctantly and returned to his tent, though he knew he wouldn't be able to sleep. As the night wore on, the whispers continued, growing louder and more insistent. Jake lay awake, listening to the ghostly voices and wondering what they wanted. He wasn't the only one who heard them. Throughout the camp, the other workers stirred and muttered in their sleep, haunted by the same eerie sounds. By dawn, the entire crew was exhausted and on edge. They gathered around the fire, drinking coffee and exchanging uneasy glances. No one mentioned the whispers, but it was clear that everyone had heard them. Frank tried to rally the workers, putting on a brave face. "All right, folks, let's get back to work. We've got a lot to do today." The crew nodded and dispersed, but the fear lingered. As they resumed their tasks, the feeling of being watched grew stronger. The old railroad seemed to pulse with a malevolent energy, and the whispers in the night hinted at a deeper, more terrifying truth yet to be uncovered. The sun climbed higher in the sky, casting long shadows over the desolate landscape. The workers moved with a palpable tension, each of them haunted by the whispers that had filled the night. Frank assigned tasks, hoping that the hard work would distract his crew from their fears. Jake was paired with Tom, a grizzled veteran of the rails who had seen more than his fair share of strange occurrences, but never let them shake his resolve. Together, they were tasked with clearing debris from a particularly overgrown section of the track. As they worked, Jake couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The shadows seemed to flicker at the edges of his vision, and every rustle of leaves made him jump. Tom, sensing his partner's anxiety, tried to lighten the mood. "Don't let this place get to you, kid," Tom said, pausing to wipe the sweat from his brow. "I've been on a lot of spooky jobs, and it's always the same. Creepy at first, but just a bunch of old stories in the end." Jake forced a smile. "Yeah, I guess you're right." They worked in silence for a while, the rhythmic clinking of their tools almost soothing. But as they neared the old signal house, the atmosphere grew heavier. The air seemed to hum with a low, unsettling frequency. Suddenly the temperature dropped, and a thick fog rolled in, enveloping the tracks. Jake shivered, rubbing his arms to ward off the cold. He glanced at Tom, who had gone rigid, his eyes wide with something between fear and disbelief. "Tom, what is it?" Jake asked, his voice trembling. Tom pointed ahead, his hand shaking. "Look." Jake followed Tom's gaze and saw it. A train, or at least the ghostly outline of one, barreling down the tracks. It moved soundlessly, its wheels turning in eerie silence. The train was semi-transparent, its carriages filled with shadowy figures staring out with hollow eyes. "Get back!" Tom shouted, grabbing Jake's arm and pulling him away from the tracks. They stumbled backward, falling into the weeds as the phantom train rushed past. Jake's heart pounded in his chest as he watched the train disappear into the fog, leaving behind only an echo of despair. "What the hell was that?" Jake gasped. Tom shook his head, his face pale. "I've heard stories, but I've never seen anything like that. We need to tell Frank." They scrambled to their feet and ran back to the main camp, their fear driving them forward. When they arrived, they found Frank and the others gathered around the fire, discussing the strange occurrences of the night. "Frank!" Tom called out, breathless. "We just saw something! Something unreal!" Frank frowned. "What are you talking about?" Jake and Tom recounted their encounter with the ghostly train, their words tumbling over each other in their urgency. The rest of the crew listened in stunned silence, their faces mirroring the fear that Jake felt. "We have to leave," Jake urged. "This place is cursed." Frank's expression hardened. "I don't believe in curses. We're here to do a job, and we're not leaving until it's done." "Frank, you didn't see it," Tom said, his voice desperate. "That train, it wasn't natural. There are things here we don't understand." Frank sighed, rubbing his temples. "Look, I get that this place is getting to all of us, but we can't just abandon the project because of a few ghost stories. We'll double up on shifts, work in pairs, and keep an eye out. But we're not quitting." The crew murmured in reluctant agreement, though the fear in their eyes was undeniable. They resumed their tasks, but the atmosphere was tense, each worker glancing over their shoulder and jumping at every sound. As the day wore on, the fog lifted and the sun shone down, but the chill in the air remained. Jake couldn't shake the feeling that the spirits of the railroad were watching them, waiting for the right moment to strike. That night, the whispers returned, louder and more insistent. Jake lay in his tent, his eyes wide open, listening to the ghostly voices that seemed to seep from the very ground beneath him. "Help us. Find peace." The words echoed in his mind, a constant reminder that they were not alone. The haunted railroad held many secrets, and the first encounter was only the beginning of the terror that awaited them. The following day dawned with an oppressive weight in the air. The workers, already wearied by their encounters, moved with a sluggishness that betrayed their growing fear. Despite Frank's reassurances, the sight of the phantom train had left a deep impression, and the whispering voices from the night had not abated. Jake and Tom, now wary of their surroundings, were assigned to clear another section of the track. As they worked, the sun climbed higher, casting harsh shadows that seemed to dance and twist in the corner of their vision. "Tom," Jake whispered, his voice barely audible over the rhythmic clink of their tools. "Do you think we'll see it again?" Tom glanced around, his eyes darting nervously. "I hope not. But keep your eyes open. This place is..." He stopped mid-sentence, his gaze fixed on something ahead. Jake followed his line of sight and felt his blood run cold. A figure stood on the tracks, its form translucent and wavering in the heat. It was dressed in old-fashioned railroad workers' clothes, complete with a tattered cap and a lantern that emitted a faint, eerie glow. The apparition's face was a mask of sorrow, its eyes hollow and lifeless. "Do you see that?" Jake whispered, unable to tear his eyes away. Tom nodded slowly, his face pale. "Yeah, I see it." The ghostly figure raised its lantern, the light flickering ominously. It seemed to be trying to communicate, its mouth moving soundlessly. Jake took a hesitant step forward, drawn by a morbid curiosity. "Wait, Jake," Tom cautioned, grabbing his arm. "We don't know what it wants." Jake shook off Tom's grip, his eyes fixed on the apparition. "Maybe it needs help. Maybe we can end this." He approached the figure cautiously, his heart pounding in his chest. The ghost's eyes locked onto his, and for a moment Jake felt a connection, a deep, overwhelming sense of sorrow and longing. "What do you want?" Jake asked softly. The apparition's mouth moved again, but no sound came out. Instead, the lantern's light brightened, casting a ghostly glow over the tracks. Jake saw other figures materializing in the distance, shadowy forms of workers who had perished on the railroad. They stood silently, watching him with a mixture of hope and despair. Suddenly, a loud crash echoed through the air, snapping Jake out of his trance. He turned to see that one of the workers, a burly man named Bill, had dropped a heavy tool chest, the contents spilling out across the ground. "What's going on over there?" Frank shouted, striding over with an air of authority. Jake turned back to the tracks, but the figures had vanished. The apparitions, the lantern light, all gone as if they had never been there. "Jake, Tom, what's the problem?" Frank demanded, his eyes narrowing. "We saw them, Frank," Tom said, his voice shaking. "The ghosts. They were right there." Frank's expression darkened. "I've had enough of this nonsense. You're letting this place get to you. We're here to work, not chase after shadows." Jake felt a surge of frustration. "Frank, we're not making this up. They need something from us. We have to figure out what it is." Frank sighed heavily. "Look, I get it. This place is creepy. But we can't stop working every time someone sees a ghost. We'll never get this job done." Jake opened his mouth to argue, but Frank cut him off. "No more ghost stories. Get back to work." Defeated, Jake and Tom returned to their tasks, but the sense of unease lingered. The apparitions had been so real, so desperate. As the day wore on, more workers reported seeing shadowy figures at the edges of their vision, flickering in and out of existence like the remnants of a long-forgotten tragedy. That night, the crew gathered around the fire, their faces drawn and weary. The whispers had grown louder, and the temperature had dropped sharply. They huddled close to the flames, seeking warmth and comfort in the flickering light. As they ate their meager dinner, the conversation turned inevitably to the day's events. "I saw a woman in an old dress standing by the tracks," one worker said, his voice barely above a whisper. "She looked so sad, like she was waiting for someone." "Me too," another chimed in. "A man in overalls with a lantern. He kept pointing down the tracks like he wanted me to follow." The stories continued, each one more unsettling than the last. Frank listened in silence, his jaw clenched. He knew he had to keep his crew together, but the fear in their eyes was undeniable. "All right, enough," Frank finally said, his voice firm. "We've all had a long day. Get some rest. We'll figure this out in the morning." As the workers retreated to their tents, the whispers grew louder, more insistent. Jake lay awake, the ghostly voices echoing in his mind. The apparitions were trying to communicate, to tell them something important. But what? The haunted railroad held its secrets close, and the ghostly apparitions were only the beginning. The crew would soon learn that the past was not easily forgotten, and the spirits of the dead would not rest until their story was told. The following morning, a heavy fog clung to the ground, muffling the sounds of the workers' movements as they prepared for another day on the haunted railroad. Despite Frank's efforts to keep morale up, a somber mood hung over the camp. The apparitions and whispers had left an indelible mark on everyone. Jake couldn't shake the feeling that the spirits were trying to convey a message. Determined to uncover the truth, he approached Frank after breakfast. "Frank, we need to investigate the signal house," Jake said, his voice resolute. "I have a feeling the answers we're looking for are in there." Frank sighed, rubbing his temples. "Jake, we have work to do. We can't afford to waste time chasing ghosts." "Please, Frank," Jake insisted. "Just give me a few hours. If we find nothing, I'll drop it. But I can't ignore this feeling." Frank regarded Jake for a long moment before finally nodding. "Fine. But take Tom with you and be quick about it. We can't fall behind schedule." Jake and Tom gathered their tools and headed toward the old signal house, a dilapidated structure that had once controlled the flow of trains along the line. Now it stood as a decaying monument to the past, its windows shattered and its walls covered in ivy. As they approached, the temperature dropped, and the whispers grew louder, as if the spirits were urging them forward. Jake pushed open the creaking door, and they stepped inside. The interior was dark and damp, with the faint smell of mildew permeating the air. Dust motes danced in the shafts of light that filtered through the broken windows. Old equipment, long since abandoned, lay scattered about, covered in layers of grime. "Let's start looking," Jake said, trying to keep his voice steady. They searched through the debris, sifting through old papers and rusted tools. After a while, Tom called out, "Jake, over here." Jake hurried over to where Tom stood, holding a weathered leather-bound journal. "I found this in a drawer," Tom said, handing it over. Jake opened the journal, its pages yellowed and brittle. The handwriting was neat, though faded with age. As he read, a chilling story began to unfold. The journal belonged to Samuel Harper, a signalman who had worked on the railroad decades ago. It detailed the numerous accidents and deaths that had plagued the line, many of which had been caused by faulty equipment and negligence. Samuel had tried to report the issues, but his concerns were ignored by the higher-ups, who prioritized profits over safety. The final entries were the most disturbing. Samuel wrote of seeing ghostly figures along the tracks, the spirits of those who had died in the accidents. He believed they were trying to warn him, to prevent further tragedies. His last entry hinted at a terrible premonition, a catastrophic crash that he feared was inevitable. "We have to show this to Frank," Jake said, his voice shaking. "This journal explains everything." Tom nodded, his face pale. "Let's go." They returned to the camp, clutching the journal like a lifeline. Frank was supervising the workers, but he turned when he saw them approaching. "What did you find?" Frank asked, his tone impatient. Jake handed him the journal. "It's from a signalman named Samuel Harper. He wrote about the accidents and the spirits. He tried to warn the company, but they didn't listen. The spirits are trying to tell us something, Frank. They want us to know the truth." Frank flipped through the pages, his brow furrowing. "This is troubling," he admitted, "but it doesn't explain why they're still here. What do they want from us?" "I think they want justice," Jake said. "They want us to acknowledge what happened, to make sure it doesn't happen again." Frank nodded slowly. "All right. We'll hold a meeting tonight. Tell the crew what we found. Maybe it will help put their minds at ease." As the day wore on, the workers continued their tasks, but the atmosphere remained tense. That evening, they gathered around the fire. The journal passed from hand to hand as Jake and Frank explained what they had discovered. "We need to honor these spirits," Jake said. "Acknowledge their suffering and promise to prevent further tragedies. Maybe then they'll find peace." The crew nodded, their faces somber. They agreed to hold a memorial service the next evening, hoping it would appease the restless spirits. That night, the whispers were different. They seemed calmer, less insistent, as if the spirits knew that their story was finally being heard. Jake lay in his tent, feeling a glimmer of hope. The past was beginning to unravel, and with it, the haunted railroad secrets were coming to light. But the journey was far from over. The crew would soon learn that the ghost's demands went beyond simple recognition, and the true extent of the horrors that had occurred on the railroad was yet to be revealed. The crew gathered solemnly the next evening, the air thick with anticipation and unease. They stood in a circle around the makeshift memorial they had created near the tracks. Old tools, photographs, and small offerings were laid out carefully, a tribute to the souls who had lost their lives on the haunted railroad. Frank, holding Samuel Harper's journal, began the ceremony. "We've come together to honor the memories of those who perished on this line. Their stories were ignored, their deaths forgotten. Tonight, we acknowledge their suffering and vow to learn from the past. The workers listened in silence, each lost in their thoughts. The setting sun cast long shadows, and the temperature dropped, a chill settling over the group. The whispering voices that had haunted their nights were silent now, as if waiting for the ceremony to conclude. As Frank continued speaking, a sense of calm seemed to descend. The workers shared stories and reflections, offering their own respects to the dead. Jake felt a glimmer of hope, believing they were finally on the right path to ending the hauntings. But the calm was short-lived. Just as the ceremony was drawing to a close, a loud, piercing scream shattered the silence. The workers turned, their eyes wide with fear, to see Bill, the burly man who had dropped the tool chest the previous day, standing at the edge of the clearing. His face was twisted in terror, and he was staring at something none of them could see. "Bill, what is it?" Frank called out, his voice steady despite the fear in his eyes. Bill didn't respond. Instead, he took a step backward, his eyes locked on the invisible presence. "Stay back!" he shouted, his voice cracking. "Stay away from me!" Jake felt a cold dread wash over him. He took a step forward, reaching out a hand. "Bill, what's wrong? Talk to us!" Bill's eyes flicked to Jake, wild and desperate. "They're here," he whispered. "They're angry. They want blood." Before anyone could react, Bill turned and ran toward the tracks. The workers shouted in alarm, rushing after him, but it was too late. Bill stumbled onto the rails, and in a horrifying instant, his body convulsed as if struck by an unseen force. He fell to the ground, his lifeless eyes staring up at the darkening sky. The crew froze, their hearts pounding with a mixture of shock and terror. Jake was the first to move, dropping to his knees beside Bill. There were no visible wounds, no sign of what had caused his death. But the look of pure fear on his face told them all they needed to know. "Frank, what do we do?" Tom asked, his voice trembling. Frank looked around, his face pale. "We need to leave," he said finally. "It's not safe here. The spirits, whatever they are, they're not appeased. We need to regroup and figure out our next move." The workers quickly gathered their belongings, their movements frantic. The haunted railroad, once a place of silent whispers and ghostly apparitions, had now claimed a living soul. The danger was no longer just a series of eerie encounters. It was real and deadly. As they retreated to their trucks, the whispers began again, louder and more menacing than ever. Jake could feel the eyes of the spirits on him, their anger palpable. The memorial had not been enough. They wanted something more, something the crew had yet to understand. They drove away from the tracks, leaving the haunted railroad behind for the night. But the fear followed them, a heavy presence that lingered in their minds. Jake couldn't shake the feeling that they had only scratched the surface of the horrors that lay in wait. Back at their temporary camp, the crew huddled together, their faces etched with worry. Frank tried to maintain a semblance of order, but the loss of Bill had shaken them all to their core. "We need to figure out what they want," Jake said, his voice barely above a whisper. "The memorial wasn't enough. There's something else, something deeper." Tom nodded. "We need more information. There has to be a reason why they're still here, why they can't move on." Frank sighed, running a hand through his hair. "We'll look for more clues in the morning. For now, everyone needs to rest. We'll keep watching shifts." As they settled into an uneasy sleep, the whispers continued, a constant reminder of the spirit's unresolved anger. Jake lay awake, staring at the stars through the canvas of his tent. He knew the road ahead would be treacherous, and the stakes had never been higher. The sacrifice had been a harsh warning. The haunted railroad demanded more than just acknowledgement. It required a deeper understanding, a resolution that would test the limits of their courage and sanity. The journey to uncover the truth was far from over, and the cost of failure was a price they could not afford to pay. The next morning, the crew gathered in the cold light of dawn, their faces pale and drawn. The death of Bill had left an indelible mark, and the whispers that haunted the night had eroded their resolve. Fear hung heavy in the air as they prepared for another day on the haunted railroad. Frank assigned tasks with a grim determination, trying to keep the crew focused. But the tension was palpable, and Jake could see the fear in everyone's eyes. They were all haunted by the same question. What would the spirits demand next? Jake and Tom were sent to inspect an old maintenance shed that had been out of use for decades. As they approached the dilapidated structure, the air grew colder, and the whispers grew louder, filling their minds with an eerie chorus of despair. "Do you think we'll find anything useful here?" Tom asked, his voice shaking. "I don't know," Jake replied, pushing open the creaking door. "But we have to try." Inside, the shed was dark and musty, filled with old tools and equipment covered in layers of dust. They searched through the debris, their movements tense and hurried. Every shadow seemed to move, and every sound set their nerves on edge. Tom found an old ledger, its pages brittle and yellowed with age. "Jake, look at this," he said, holding it out. Jake took the ledger and began to read. It contained records of maintenance work, notes about repairs, and, most intriguingly, mentions of accidents that had been quietly covered up by the railroad company. The ledger detailed numerous instances of faulty equipment, ignored safety protocols, and the resulting fatalities. "They knew," Jake said, his voice filled with anger. "They knew about the dangers and did nothing to stop them. All those deaths could have been prevented." Tom nodded, his face grim. No wonder the spirits are angry. They were betrayed. As they continued to search, they found more evidence of the company's negligence. Letters from workers pleading for safer conditions, reports of near misses that were never addressed, and photographs of the aftermath of horrific accidents. Jake felt a growing sense of dread. The spirits were not just seeking acknowledgement. They wanted justice for the lives that had been lost due to the company's greed and negligence. The crew was now caught in the middle of a conflict that had been brewing for decades. When they returned to camp, they shared their findings with Frank and the rest of the crew. The revelations only deepened the sense of fear and paranoia that had taken hold. "We have to do something," Jake said, his voice urgent. "We can't just keep working like nothing's wrong. We need to expose what happened here." Frank nodded, his expression weary. "You're right. But how? The company's long gone, and the people responsible are probably dead by now." Tom spoke up. "Maybe we can find a way to make amends, to show the spirits that we're on their side. We need to find out what they want, what will give them peace." The crew agreed, but the strain was taking its toll. As the day wore on, the atmosphere grew more oppressive. The whispers became a constant background noise, gnawing at their sanity. Arguments broke out over small issues, and the fear of another supernatural attack hung over them like a dark cloud. Jake could see the signs of exhaustion and fear in his fellow workers. Their eyes were bloodshot from lack of sleep, and their movements were sluggish and uncoordinated. The once tight-knit crew was beginning to fray at the edges. That night, the whispers were louder than ever, filling the camp with an unbearable cacophony. Jake lay in his tent, his mind racing. He could hear the voices of the dead, their pleas for justice and their cries of anguish. Sleep was impossible. In the early hours of the morning, A scream pierced the air. Jake bolted upright and rushed out of his tent to find one of the workers, a man named Harry, thrashing on the ground. His eyes were wide with terror, and he was babbling incoherently. "They're here! They're all around us!" Harry screamed. "I can't take it anymore!" Frank and the others tried to calm him down, but Harry's fear was uncontrollable. He broke free from their grasp and ran into the darkness, disappearing into the fog that shrouded the tracks. "Harry, come back!" Frank shouted, but it was no use. The whispers seemed to swell, enveloping the camp in a chorus of despair. Jake felt a cold dread settle in his stomach. The spirits were driving them to the brink of madness, and Harry's breakdown was just the beginning. They had to find a way to end this, or they would all be lost. The crew spent the rest of the night in a state of high alert, but there was no sign of Harry. As dawn broke, the workers huddled together, their fear palpable. "We can't go on like this," Jake said, his voice shaking. "We need to find a way to communicate with the spirits, to understand what they want." Frank nodded, his face etched with worry. "We'll search the area for more clues. There has to be something we've missed." As they prepared to continue their investigation, Jake couldn't shake the feeling that time was running out. The haunted railroad demanded answers, and the descent into madness had only just begun. Determined to find answers, Jake, Frank, and the rest of the crew set out to search the area for more clues. The morning light cast eerie shadows on the railroad, and the fog clung to the ground, refusing to lift. The oppressive atmosphere weighed heavily on everyone, but they pushed forward, driven by a desperate need to end the terror that had gripped them. Jake and Tom returned to the maintenance shed, hoping to find something they had missed. The interior was just as dark and foreboding as before, but Jake felt a renewed sense of purpose. They began to sift through the debris, meticulously examining every item. "Jake, over here!" Tom called, his voice tense. Jake hurried over and saw Tom holding a small, locked metal box. The lock was rusted, but it looked like it could be forced open. They pried it open with a crowbar, revealing a stack of old letters and photographs inside. The letters were from Samuel Harper, the signalman, addressed to his family and friends. They painted a picture of a man deeply troubled by the events he had witnessed on the railroad. Samuel had detailed the accidents and the spirits, expressing his guilt for not being able to prevent the tragedies. One letter stood out. It was addressed to the railroad company, a final plea from Samuel to halt operations until the safety issues were addressed. The letter was never sent, instead buried in the box. Attached to it was a photograph of Samuel standing with other workers, all of whom had died in the accidents. Jake felt a chill run down his spine. "Tom, we need to take this back to Frank. It might be the key to understanding what the spirits want." They returned to the camp, where the crew had gathered in a tense silence. Frank looked up as they approached, his face lined with worry. "What did you find?" he asked. Jake handed him the letters and the photograph. "These were written by Samuel Harper. He tried to stop the accidents, but the company ignored him. He felt responsible for the deaths." Frank read through the letters, his expression growing more somber with each page. "This poor man, he was trying to do the right thing, but no one listened." Tom nodded. "The spirits must be seeking justice for what happened. Samuel was their voice, and he was silenced." Frank looked around at the crew. "We need to honor Samuel and the other workers. We need to hold another ceremony, but this time, we have to address their demands directly." The crew agreed, their resolve strengthening. They began preparations for a more formal ceremony, gathering materials to create a proper memorial. As the sun set, they arranged the letters and photographs around the memorial, adding tools and personal items they had found during their work. As night fell, the crew lit torches and gathered in a circle around the memorial. Frank stepped forward, holding Samuel's final letter. "We gather here tonight to honor the memory of Samuel Harper and all the workers who lost their lives on this railroad," Frank began, his voice steady. "We acknowledge the negligence that led to their deaths and vow to ensure their story is told and their sacrifice is not forgotten." The crew listened in silence, the weight of the moment pressing down on them. Jake felt a sense of connection to the spirits, a shared understanding of their pain and anger. "We ask for your forgiveness," Frank continued. "We're here to set things right, to make sure that what happened here is never forgotten and never repeated." As Frank spoke, the air grew colder, and the whispers began to rise, a haunting chorus that seemed to come from all around them. The crew held their breath, waiting for a sign that their words had been heard. Suddenly, a figure appeared at the edge of the clearing. It was Samuel Harper, his ghostly form illuminated by the torchlight. He looked at the crew with a mixture of sadness and gratitude. "Thank you," Samuel's voice echoed, clear and strong despite his ethereal form. "You have heard our pleas and acknowledged our suffering. But there is one more thing you must do." The crew watched in awe as Samuel pointed to the tracks. The accidents were not just due to negligence. There was deliberate sabotage by those who wanted to profit from the disaster. The truth must be uncovered, and those responsible must be held accountable. Jake felt a surge of determination. "We'll find the evidence, Samuel. We'll make sure the truth comes out." Samuel nodded, his form beginning to fade. "Do this, and we will find peace." With that, Samuel and the other ghostly figures vanished, leaving the crew in stunned silence. The air felt lighter, the oppressive atmosphere lifting slightly. Frank turned to the crew. "You heard him. We need to find the evidence of sabotage and bring it to light. It's the only way to end this." The crew nodded, their fear replaced by a steely resolve. They had faced the spirits and survived, but their task was far from over. They would uncover the truth and ensure that the haunted railroad's tragic history was finally put to rest. As they prepared to resume their work the next day, Jake felt a sense of hope. They had taken the first step towards justice, and now they would see it through to the end. The final confrontation had given them the clarity and purpose they needed to face the horrors of the past and bring peace to the restless spirits of the haunted railroad. With a renewed sense of purpose, the crew set out to uncover the truth behind the sabotage Samuel Harper had spoken of. The air was still thick with the memory of their encounter, but the oppressive weight had lessened, replaced by a steely resolve. They split into groups, searching every inch of the railroad for clues that would lead them to the saboteurs. Jake and Tom returned to the maintenance shed, their eyes sharper and their movements more deliberate. They sifted through the old records and equipment, looking for anything that might point to foul play. "Jake, over here!" Tom called, holding up a stack of old, yellowed newspapers. Jake joined him, and they began to read. The articles detailed a series of mysterious accidents that had plagued the railroad, but one name kept appearing in connection with the disasters. Charles Withers, a wealthy businessman who had invested heavily in the railroad. "This Withers guy seems to have a lot to gain from these accidents," Tom said, his voice tight with anger. "Look, every time there's an accident, he buys up more shares at a lower price." Jake's eyes narrowed. It makes sense. He sabotaged the railroad to drive the price down and make a profit. We need to find concrete evidence linking him to the sabotage. They searched the shed meticulously, finally uncovering a hidden compartment in one of the desks. Inside, they found a stack of correspondence between Withers and a shadowy figure known only as RJ. The letters detailed plans to tamper with equipment and cause accidents, all for financial gain. "This is it," Jake said, his heart pounding. "This is the proof we need." They hurried back to the camp where Frank and the others were waiting anxiously. Jake handed Frank the letters, his eyes blazing with determination. "This proves it," Jake said. "Withers and his accomplice were behind the sabotage. We need to take this to the authorities." Frank nodded, his face set in grim determination. "We'll go to the town sheriff. He needs to see this." The crew packed up and made their way to the nearest town, a small, sleepy place that had seen its fair share of hardship. The sheriff, a stern-looking man named Alan Cooper, listened intently as Jake and Frank explained the situation and presented the evidence. "This is serious," Sheriff Cooper said, his voice grave. "I'll launch an investigation immediately. If Withers is responsible, he'll be brought to justice." As the sheriff began his investigation, the crew returned to the railroad to finish their work. The atmosphere was tense but hopeful. They had taken the first step towards justice, and the spirits seemed to respond, the whispers growing softer and less insistent. That night, as the crew settled in, Jake lay in his tent, listening to the now muted whispers. He felt a sense of peace beginning to settle over the haunted railroad. The spirits were finally being heard, and their demands for justice were being met. But as the crew continued their work, they couldn't shake the feeling that the final test was yet to come. The spirits had shown them the way, but the path was fraught with danger. They had to remain vigilant. A week later, Sheriff Cooper arrived at the camp with news. "We've arrested Withers and his accomplice," he announced. "They've confessed to everything. Thanks to your efforts, justice will be served." The crew cheered, their relief palpable. The shadow that had hung over the railroad was beginning to lift. That evening they held another ceremony, this time to celebrate their victory and honor the spirits who had guided them. As they stood around the memorial, Frank spoke once more. "We've done it. We've brought the truth to light and honored the memories of those who died here. May they finally find peace." The air grew still, and for the first time in weeks, the crew felt a deep, comforting silence. The spirits had been heard, their demands for justice met. The haunted railroad, once a place of terror and despair, had been transformed into a place of remembrance and closure. Jake felt a sense of accomplishment and peace wash over him. They had faced unimaginable horrors and emerged victorious. The haunted railroad had demanded much from them, but in the end, they had risen to the challenge. As they packed up their camp and prepared to leave the railroad for the last time, Jake took one final look at the tracks. The shadows seemed less menacing now, the whispers gone. The spirits had found peace, and so had the crew. The journey had been long and harrowing, but they had uncovered the truth and brought justice to the forgotten souls of the haunted railroad. The line would remain silent, a solemn reminder of the past, but its ghosts had finally been laid to rest.